When covering shipwrecks, there are some names that jump out immediately. Indianapolis, Musashi, Hornet, Kaga, and quite a few others. There are other wrecks where the first reaction might be, "What ship are you talking about?" followed by, "Wait, they found that ship?" Wrecks like USS Strong or the ship that sank her, Nizuki, qualify here. I have covered both of those wrecks because they didn't get much attention when discovered. In today's video, we'll look at another Japanese example, the light cruiser Jintsu, which saw little coverage of her discovery. This is a classic example of a wreck that slipped under the metaphorical radar. This isn't surprising because 2019 was absolutely stacked with shipwreck discoveries. Let's change that lack of coverage with this video, beginning, as always, with the brief overview of her sinking. Jintsu's end came at the Battle of Kolimbangara on July 13, 1943. This involved a Tokyo Express transport run intended to reinforce Japanese positions on the island. Just one of many such runs, but this time would end poorly for Jintsu. Not long after arriving off the island, the Japanese detected a nearby Allied fleet. This was a formation including USS Honolulu, USS St. Louis, and HMNZS Leander, all three of which outgunned Jintsu. The two American ships severely outgunned her at that. Jintsu had 7 14cm, 5.5-inch guns in single mounts. Honolulu and St. Louis had 15 6-inch, 152mm guns each. Toss in the 8 guns on Leander, and that's 38 6-inch guns against 7 guns on Jintsu. The destroyer matchup wasn't much better, with 10 destroyers on the Allied side against 9 on the Japanese side, with 4 of those being used as transports. This was a lopsided match, if there ever was one. So, the Japanese did their usual strategy, send a volley of long-lance torpedoes at the enemy contact. This was standard practice for the Japanese, and would prove as deadly as ever. Several Allied ships would suffer torpedo hits during this battle. What was less standard was the decision by Jintsu's commander to turn on searchlights. This illuminated the Allied formation, but it also made the antique cruiser a very visible target. This proved to be a poor choice. Not long after the searchlights snapped on, at around 1 a.m. on July 13th, Jintsu was taken under fire. Multiple 6-inch shells slammed into the cruiser, setting her on fire and crippling the ship. The command staff was killed almost instantly, and most of the weaponry fell silent. Adrift and ablaze, Jintsu was hit by a torpedo soon after. This blew the ship in two, either directly or through a secondary explosion. The flaming wreck, now in 2 pieces, sank soon after. While the landing operation would prove a success, Jintsu was lost to time. Until, of course, her wreck was rediscovered many, many years later. Specifically in early 2019. On April 26th of that year, RV Petrel's team announced the discovery of Jintsu's wreck. The cruiser was in 2 pieces, as expected. Beyond that obvious damage, though, the wreck is pretty well preserved, especially by Japanese standards. Resting at a depth of 900 meters, or 2,952 feet, Jintsu is relatively shallow by Pacific War standards. This makes the lack of sea life on this wreck a bit surprising. Jintsu's hull is clearly visible, with barely any marine growth. However, without any sonar provided by Petrel, we can move directly to that wreck. Starting here with the bow. This section of the wreck, as you can see, is on its side. From this angle, we're looking at the front. The shape is still recognizable with the slight curve leading up from the waterline. There's even wiring still visible here, which I believe is degaussing cable. And just above that, you have the remnants of the Imperial chrysanthemum. Looking at that closer in, you can see the teak backing. That is, in the end, all that survived. The crest itself has long since rotted away. The only way to tell this was the chrysanthemum is the round shape of its backing and the position on the bow. Every large Japanese warship had one of these, but on the wrecks, they're always gone. How much is left varies, but Jintsu is a good example here. Moving back out from there, we have a different look at the bow. The angle shows the area further down, which is interesting. While the shape of the bow remains intact, the structure is crumpled. It's almost rippled, actually, as you can see here. This is something you don't see often, at least not on such a large piece of a wreck. Rippled skin on a rudder is one thing, but on the bow, that's not exactly common. Jintsu's bow was compressed in, and unevenly at that. Unfortunately, we don't have a look at the rest of the bow to compare to. This is as far down as Petrel went, and they didn't release any images of the break itself. So, let's move on. This was the only hull-focused part of the wreck, so the remainder will focus on the weaponry. With the exception of one bit broken off from the rest of the hull, that we'll see later. First, one of the cruiser's main guns. As mentioned earlier, Jintsu carried 7 single-mounted 5.5-inch guns. Petrel released video of 3 of them, starting with this one. The gun itself is in pretty good shape. The mount has no visible damage from this angle. The barrel is also firmly in place, if pointed skyward. Even the marine growth is pretty minimal compared to a lot of other wrecks. As for the deck around it, that's also mostly intact. There's a bit of a break here where the deck has collapsed and folded in. Other than that, there's very little deck damage in this area. For as good as it is, however, the same can't be said for the superstructure. The Sendai-class cruisers, including Jintsu, had 2 guns mounted in wing positions. Those were on either side of the bridge and mast. The fact you can't see either of those here means they were destroyed. The mast will be shown later on, and it looks like one of the legs is broken off here. The bridge, on the other hand, seems to be completely gone. As this picture on the surface shows, that should be visible by this gun. That means this area is probably either at or close to the break, which implies bad things about the bridge and whatever crew was there. In any event, from closer in, you can see the top of the mount. There's no visible damage here either, and the mast leg is more visible right here, although there's still no sign of the bridge. So, let's move on. The next picture shows one of these stern mounts. This is trained out to the side, which gives an excellent view of the back of the mount, and, for that matter, of the deck around it. This is, like the forward area, in pretty much perfect condition, considering the situation. It's not notably damaged, and it's not covered in silt either. That means you can even make out a porthole here, and some sort of equipment here. From closer in, you can see more of that equipment. I'm not sure exactly what it is, not from this lighting, but the fact it's there and visible is impressive. There are newer ships, sunk later, that don't show that kind of preservation. The same goes for the mount, or rather beneath it. The angle it's resting at lets you see the dividing line between the regular deck and where it was reinforced to hold the weight of the gun mount. As for the mount itself, it's more overgrown than the other one, including some sponges like on Independence's wreck. Not as large or as many, but familiar if you've watched that video. The marine life is far more apparent when you look closer in. It doesn't look that bad from a distance, but up close it's absolutely covering things. And yet, even with that, you can still see some interesting detail. Specifically, the dials on the side and the breech of the gun. Those dials seem to be legible, but they're a bit too out of focus to make out. As for the breech, while it's got stuff growing on it, the shape is still visible. Even here, where you can make out the shape of the breech block. With that covered, though, let's look at the last gun. This is, I believe, the one on the opposite side of the ship from the first mount, judging from the angle we're looking at anyway. It's trained out in almost the exact same way, so without further context, I can't rule out this being the same gun. Either way, it's pretty much the same as the first one, so there's not much to speak of. As such, let's round off this section with the 125mm gun mount recorded. This one isn't really interesting for the gun, admittedly. It's an overgrown 25mm morale booster, like on most Japanese wrecks. This one is somewhat unique for being a twin mount instead of the more common single and triples. Beyond that, not much to say. The mount is in pretty good shape, while the barrels are completely covered. It's the area around the mount that's interesting. You can see more intact deck here. There's also some sort of structure behind the mount, perhaps the base of a funnel. It's too dark to be entirely certain. On the other hand, beneath the mount, we have much better lighting. And here, you have 2 intact portholes with, at worst, cracked glass. What makes these more interesting is the fact the hull has rusted away around them. This porthole in particular is basically hanging on by a thread. Intact portholes are always impressive on these wrecks, but these take it to another level. The glass is still there, and they've remained in place even while the ship rusted out around them. Definitely not something you see every day. The rest of this area, for its part, has some boxes on the deck and some of that cable here. Now, let's finish off the weaponry with the torpedo tubes. These are interesting in their own right, and there's a reason I used one for the thumbnail. First and foremost, they're quadruple tubes. If you just use Wiki as a source, you'd be surprised by this. It makes no mention of Jintsu receiving quadruple tubes, after all. Yet, here they are, trained out and hanging over the side. I'm not sure if they were jarred loose, or if this was some final attempt to fight back by the crew. Regardless, both sets are still aboard the ship. Barely aboard, yes, but still there. This one is missing one of the torpedoes, but the other 3 remain in place. The deck has collapsed on top of it, but for the most part, the hull here is in one piece. There's even another porthole here. The other set of tubes, for its part, is in much worse shape. Only one torpedo is here, maybe, while the others are gone, and 2 of the tubes are missing as well. This side is in far worse shape, although Petrel did move a bit closer in. So we get a look at the back of the mount, which is much better. Rusty, but with the detail visible. Even the training gear here. With that mount done, though, there's only one weapon left, and that's a lone depth charge here, next to empty racks. The others probably fell off during the sinking. On the other hand, those being missing does allow for seeing the racks, and having one still aboard makes for an interesting comparison as well. There's also more of the hull and cable here, and some sort of debris here resting on a silty deck. Now with that done, there's only one thing left on the ship itself. That's the aircraft catapult here. It's also covered in sea life, including sponges. But Jintsu continues to impress otherwise, because this is still on the ship at all. If you've watched these videos, you know that catapults generally fall off. It's one of the most common things to see in a debris field, actually. Yet, it remained aboard here. Unfortunately, while that's impressive, the area is too dark to make out more than that. So let's finish this video off with the mast. As mentioned earlier, this fell away from the ship. It landed on its side like the bow, but in much worse shape. Much of it is buried in mud, and it's rusted out where exposed. There's the remnants of a ladder here, and what I think are fire control directors here. I can't be certain, though, with how they look. Even closer in, like here, it's tough to make out. Those could also be searchlights, for example. In any case, the last picture shows a platform further down the mast. The railing here is crusty with rust, but it remains there. It seems a good picture to end this video on, showing the passage of time and a good comparison to the rest of the ship, which is, all things considered, in pretty good shape. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.